A couple of weeks ago, I met an old friend, and I hadn't seen him for so long I didn't recognize him. I was trying to figure out who he was, but he mentioned his name, and then I said, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe I didn't recognize you." We'd shared a number of things together, um, but at some point he said, "Do you remember that poem about the mouse?" And I said, "A mouse?" And then I I tried one I remembered about a mouse, and he said, "Yeah, that's the one." It's funny he would remember that one. That's kind of a little children's poem, and I learned it from my mother. And thinking about it, it might be one of the first poems I ever learned. I guess I'll recite it right now. It's not very long. It's silly. My mother was from England, and so she spoke with an English accent, so I might go a little bit English on this one. It's called A Little Gray Mouse. A little gray mouse looked out one night when the moon in the kitchen was shining bright, and he said, "Here's a chance for some splendid sport, for Pussy is out, and I shan't get caught." He climbed on the shelf, and he crept up a pan, and he left his trail on the dripping can. He tasted the bacon, and nibbled the cheese, and never said thank you, or if you please. He made a hole in the pigeon pie, and dived in a flour barrel standing by. And when he had eaten as much as he might, and the moon grew pale in the morning light, he pricked up his ears and scampered down to his warm little bed in Mouseytown. Oh, I guess I'm not going to shut it off. um, so yeah, I said that one for my friend John that I met a week and a half or so ago. And so I'm going to try to go through a little bit of my history with poetry. I'm not going to recite all or very many. So that might be the first one I learned from my mother, probably in Ontario. And she didn't know very many, but she knew that one. And then I learned that my dad knew poetry also. So he typed a few up for me. One of them was If, I-F, by Rudyard Kipling. And it's really cool. I think about reciting it. I'm sure I have it recorded on YouTube somewhere. It's a little longer. And so I memorized that one, and then he typed me up a long one, which seemed really long at the time. A British poem, English, takes place in London with two boys who are very poor, and one in particular who falls off a bridge, and how sad it is. And then he wakes up in the hospital, and he thinks he's in heaven because everything's so nice in there, and music is playing. And then he sees the doctor, and he says, "Please, are you God?" he said, because he'd heard about God and heaven and everything. So I learned that one, and I recited that maybe in the 5th grade for my classmates, and everyone was really impressed. And then I think I did it in the 8th grade at a talent show in my first year in high school, and the audience there were other acts also, and the audience was standing on the gymnasium floor, and we were performing up in the bleachers just close to the edge of the gym floor. And so when I did that poem, it seemed like I had the audience standing up for a long, long time listening to it. And they were so happy when it was over. They gave me a huge round of applause, and I won the award or whatever for best talent. But it was like a standing ovation, but they were already standing. But anyway, it was a big boost to my my confidence in reciting poetry and performing. And my dad typed up a couple of other poems for me too, which I also learned. Oh, and quite early on, maybe even before that one, I learned Casey at the Bat, which I've used a lot over the years, especially when I was younger. Neighborhood kids would come over and we'd play in my uh, shed out in the backyard, and I'd make up plays and things. And I think I would often recite that poem, and I'd try to get other people to play the different parts in the poem of Casey at the Bat. And I remember we'd do little skits and plays that I would just make up on the spot. Sometimes I'd pretend I was a female school teacher in a, kind of a woman's voice, and I'd get everything wrong. And usually I'd end up falling upside down into a trash can or something like that. It was a lot of fun, just a few kids that were around. And then I'd make up stories and long, elaborate stories sometimes. So as far as poetry, in high school, I'm thinking maybe 8th grade, possibly even 7th grade before high school. I came across a poem in a literature book. It was the longest poem I'd ever seen up to that time. I think one of the longest poems in the world is Mahabharata in India, the story about the Kurukshetra War. And there's some competition for other poems that might be longer, but it was probably one of the earlier poems. And it was passed on by word of mouth for many generations, thousands of years. And that's maybe why it endured so well during the Dark Ages. A lot of books were lost in the Dark Ages. The library in Alexandria in Egypt was maybe one of the largest libraries, and it burned down. Very few books survived. Euclid's geometry somehow made it through, and some astronomy books were picked up by the Arabs, and they became at the forefront of astronomy. And then they introduced those ideas to the Europeans later, who kind of developed them further. But Mahabharata is the longest, really long poem anyway, and it's been published in much shorter books. It's about the Lord Krishna and cousins who were fighting each other, and all the lessons, particularly spiritual lessons that they learned back in that time, and that kind of transliterate into us as humans, and what lessons and morals and behavior we can learn, and how our soul and our ego work together. Anyway, that wasn't the poem I memorized. I'd still be working on it, I think, if I'd picked that one. I picked this longest poem I'd seen at that time, called The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And I thought, well, I'll start learning that one. That'll be really something if I can learn The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So I started, I think I was about 12, and I got quarter of the way through, and I learned the rest of it 10 years later when I was 22. And then I started haranguing people with this poem. The idea is that the Ancient Mariner goes on this very difficult and adventurous ocean voyage and barely survives, and he comes back, and all the other crew members of the ship died, but the mariner survived, and when he gets back to England, he's compelled to tell his story. So he kind of corners this guest at a wedding, and at first the wedding guest tries to get away, but then the mariner kind of mesmerizes him with his glittering eye, and the wedding guest is sort of forced to listen to this whole story. And so I would kind of do the same thing. I would kind of grab people and I'd start reciting the poem and they couldn't really get away. It's about 40 minutes long. One time I was with a friend in Encinitas, California, where I moved later on, and maybe we mentioned that poem or something, and he thought he would impress me, so he um, quoted a couple of lines from the poem, and that was his big mistake because then I continued on with the entire rest of the poem, and he was like spellbound. He couldn't believe that, you know, he thought he would impress me with those two lines, but then I knew the whole poem. But that was, I think, the last time that I ever cornered anybody with that poem. I decided I wouldn't do it anymore. But I have been invited one time in particular with an audience, a fairly good sized audience, to recite it. And I don't get very many requests for it, but it's kind of my main poem. I'd probably have to go over it if I were going to recite it again. I used to make sure I recited my long poems at least once a year to myself so I would remember them. So, anyway, there's that poem, and then I learned many other poems afterwards, a lot of children's poems and things. So, about 15 or 20 years ago, I put all my poems that I have memorized together in a book. The book is called The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Other Poems for Dramatic Recitation. And I explain how to memorize poems in the book, and the book starts with the really easy ones for children, for little children, and then it goes through progressively more, adult poems and moral, philosophical, adventurous, spiritual towards the end of the book. I think I'll do one little poem. I talk about it in the book. It's possible, I think, to memorize this poem just by reading it one time. I probably read it, more than one time before I tried to recollect it. But it's a poem written by A. Milne, who also wrote, I'm pretty sure, Winnie the Pooh and a number of other children's books. This little poem is called, let me say, it's A. Milne wrote a lot of poems where he included his little son who was 2 years old or, less than 5 years old, I think. And he put his little son Christopher into a lot of his poems. And Christopher, as he grew up and was going to school, I guess he would get teased by the other kids. They would say lines from some of these poems, and I think he very much resented that his father had written these poems about him. Anyway, this one is about Christopher Robin, A. Milne's little son, and it's called Hoppity. Christopher Robin goes hoppity, 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 hop. Whenever I tell him politely to stop it, he says he can't possibly stop. For if he stopped hopping, he couldn't do anything. Poor little Christopher couldn't do anything. That's why he always goes hoppity, 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 hop. And that's it. And I really felt like you could read that one time and remember it, but maybe you need to read it a few times. And then I describe in the book how to memorize poems by covering the lines up with a card, and you expose the top line, you read it, and you cover it back up, and you say it over. Hopefully you remembered it from reading it, and then you just go down the page and you keep checking if you remembered the previous lines. And I don't always use a card, but that's the basic technique, is you just kind of work your way down, and somehow the lines to the poems stick in your mind. Let's see, anything else about poetry? I've recited them a lot at birthday parties and different events. I have a number of humorous poems. I played the Comedy Store in La Jolla, California in 1979. I didn't know anything about it, probably never heard of it before. But some friends told me about it and they said, you should go there. So I went there and I signed up, and I was the last or one of the last performances. But before that, I couldn't believe, the types of words and language that people were using in their comedy. And my act was like for children and families. So I went ahead and did it. I had several layers of clothing on, several coats and hats, and I just whatever I could find was kind of my costume. And throughout my performance, I would start removing, different coats and things. But it was, mostly kid stuff. But there's one poem called called Albert and the Lion, and I recited that a lot in those days. It's a humorous British poem, and a lot of my friends mention it, remember that poem. And I did, other goofy things as well. And so at the end, they had each of the actors, each of the performers or comedians come up, and the audience would applaud for each one of them. And I was maybe the last one or near the end, and they gave me a standing ovation, and I won the award for best comedy. I guess it was so different and maybe refreshing compared to the other people. And so they invited me to come back, and I tried to think of something else to do, and all these really gross kind of comedy things that people had done kept invading my mind, and I thought, I don't know what I can do. And so I tried to come up with something. And now it's 45 years later, I guess, and I still think, well, maybe I'll go back and say, well, you invited me to come back, and here I am, and I'm going to do this. I'd kind of like to do that. We'll see what happens. So I think that covers the poetry. I'm really interested in poetry. I'm always hoping people will invite me to recite things, but nowadays I think I'd have to check up if I still remember some of the poems. My book is in Las Vegas right now, and I'm in California, so I need to get a hold of that book so I can. I wrote the book actually in order to have a handy reference to check if I remembered the poems. And a lot of them didn't make it into the book. I guess I didn't think of them at the time, and some made it in there that I'll probably remove. I'm hoping to publish it on Amazon pretty soon. It's just needs some reworking. Okay, so I guess I'll stop about poetry. I'm sure I'll think of something else. When the very first public recital I did for the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner was in Grand Forks in British Columbia, Canada. And I think I had one or two people showed up, which was very nice. I think they enjoyed it. I did the recital in Balboa Park. I got permission to recite poetry and things in there, so I would go through all my poems most of them that I knew over and over during the course of a day, and I'd go to different areas of Balboa Park and recite. And I got a few donations, not really enough to make it worthwhile. And there's a little amphitheater that I went to, and I started reciting there, and people started coming into the little amphitheater, and I was going through different poems, and then there was one guy who came in, and he heard the recitation, and he saw the people. I don't know how many, not many people, under 10 maybe, but he came in and he sat right in the very front row so he could, be part of this, and he was listening, and I was reciting, and then the other people in the amphitheater kind of left during one of the poems. and he was still there, and he was all excited and kind of really getting into it. And then he happened to look behind him, and all the other people were gone, and he was the only one there, and he kind of snuck away at that point. Okay, I guess I'm done talking about poetry. I imagine more things will come up. And I'm trying to get through these stories of my life, and I'm kind of still in the early days. And I'm kind of looking forward to getting to some of the more recent things. So I hope you're enjoying them. I got at least my last recording on jumping off bridges. So far, I got 2 people that watched it. Oh, I think actually that was me. I watched it twice, or part of it twice. So nobody else yet, but I imagine there will be a few who will take a look at it. Who knows? I figure I should put out there what I can do and what I know, and I'm hoping people might relate to some of these stories, and it'll, help people in some way. So thanks for listening.